Future Shock. Chapter 10. The Coming Oil Shock. Peak oil. It's basic economics and simple logic. As long as growth in oil supplies isn't keeping pace with growing demand, oil prices will continue rising. Stephen Lieb. Human beings survived for thousands and thousands of years without oil and without natural gas. We've never known humanity or life on this planet to survive without clean water. Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin. Since the birth of the Industrial Revolution, everything economic has been conditioned by oil. Oil is the bloodstream of the world economy. It keeps things moving, powering our modes of transportation, heating our homes, putting food on our tables, and a multitude of other indispensable products and services. But one thing we must not forget, and sometimes it fades in the memory of modern civilization, is that oil is a non-renewable, finite resource that is quickly being depleted at an unknown exponential rate, leaving experts and economists guessing about the remaining reserves. Our world is addicted to oil. It is key to all we do, to every facet of our economy. And a policy of keeping the world dependent on oil for as long as possible is highly dangerous and short-sighted. In fact, oil needs to be surpassed by a new energy vector or vectors, and the sooner we get that realization by decree and mandate, the better it will be for the entire planet. Oil is one of the main culprits causing global warming, and every year 1 billion gallons of oil is spilled into the oceans, causing unknown damage to marine life and our ecosystem. Up to 70% of a 42-gallon barrel of oil is refined into transportation fuels: gasoline, 19.4 gallons, diesel fuel, jet fuel, railroad fuel, and maritime fuel. The rest is used to make over 6,000 products that permeate almost every facet of our earthy existence. Nearly 98% of all transportation energy comes from oil, so oil will not be an easily replaceable commodity. In 2012, it is clear that we have moved from an era of cheap, abundant energy to an era of hard-to-get, expensive energy. Cheap oil literally made the world go around. The actual size of this problem is not well understood, especially by politicians, mainstream media, and a wide spectrum of corporate executives that continue to build things that accommodate a future of abundant oil. With just 5% of the world's population, for decades, the U.S. consumed 25% of the world's oil production. However, for 4 decades, the U.S. has lacked a cohesive energy policy. Every president since Nixon has called for energy independence, and it has not been done. It's a massive problem no politician wants to tackle unless forced into a historic situation where something has to be done. The 1970s was the wake-up call. However, the U.S. continued on a path of importing oil and maintaining a foreign policy of protecting energy interests abroad. After 8 decades in Middle Eastern affairs, the U.S. has become a permanent fixture in the region with foreign policy centered on the production and protection of American oil interests. Oil addiction has dominated our way of life, with a consumption pattern of over 20 million barrels per day and rising. This is unsustainable and will ultimately lead to a devastating collapse. A brief history of oil. Over the past 150 to 200 years, the Industrial Revolution promoted the widespread use of oil. Since 1860, black gold, oil, has dominated the economic life of nations throughout the world, and, after decades of usage, has taken on an omnipresent nature that's making it essential to the functioning of modern societies. Geologists and others estimate that we have taken 1 trillion barrels of black gold from the earth, and that there may be another trillion left. However, embedded in that analysis is the fact that humanity has extracted the majority of the easy-to-find conventional oil that gushes out of the ground under pressure once it's released. If in fact there is another 1 trillion barrels of oil in the earth, much of it is unconventional sources and very difficult and expensive to produce. Of course, we have to keep in mind that the use of oil is destroying our environment, the ozone, and causing massive pollution throughout the planet. Thus, for various reasons, a 150-year party of cheap oil has come to an end. The golden age of oil is over, an age that created a standard of living unsurpassed in any previous age. With the start of the 20th century, America's thirst for oil was driven by new inventions, assembly line productions in cars, household products, and a host of other things. For nearly 100 years, the U.S. was on top of the oil pyramid. History tells us that the last major U.S. discoveries of oil were made in 1930, and by 1970 the U.S. had hit peak oil. Prior to the phenomenon of peak oil in the U.S., all of the big promising areas in the lower 48 states have been explored. Up until the 1950s, the U.S. was leading the world in oil production and was essentially the Saudi Arabia of global oil. During that period, 2 out of every 3 barrels of oil produced in the world came from the U.S. So, until 1970, the U.S. produced more than 2/3 of the oil it needed. America was self-sufficient. It's also interesting to note that in the early 1970s, half of the entire world was not a major user of oil. In September 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was started by Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Venezuela. This was a significant event and the development of a major trading bloc which in time would amass enormous power in global economics and politics. The initial 5 OPEC nations were later joined by Qatar, Indonesia, Libya, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Nigeria, and Ecuador. One of the most devastating effects of the Vietnam War during the 1960s was the enormous impact it would ultimately have on the American dollar and the consequent deficit spending binge. This period set the stage for the turbulent 1970s and the wave of major restructuring in currency markets worldwide, which by extension would ultimately have an inflationary impact on the pricing of oil. American deficit spending during the 1960s led the nation to a point where it became necessary to abandon the gold standard. The gold standard, where currencies were backed by gold, had supported the price of gold at $35 an ounce from 1934 to roughly the first half of 1971. With the euro-dollar and other currency markets flooded with American dollars, the price of gold had to be revised. It became uneconomical and too cheap to maintain gold at that price level. The dramatic drop in America's gold supplies from $25 billion to $9 billion prior to 1971 laid the foundation for a series of major developments in world international finance and economics. On August 15, 1971, America, under the direction of the Nixon administration, came off the gold standard in a move to devalue its currency. This led to the total breakdown of the gold standard in the West and the beginning phase of the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement negotiated in 1944 and 45. A new standard was introduced which would be based on a system of free-floating exchange rates, where currency relationships are determined by the law of supply and demand. Gold prices were allowed to work their will, and they did, to the tune of $850 per ounce by the first quarter of 1980. These arrangements did not please everyone in the world community, and the repercussions brought about many unpleasant results. OPEC's initial response to this international maneuver was to raise the price of oil, a practice that continued throughout the 1970s. Thus, the break from the gold standard ultimately triggered the price hikes in the pervasive oil energy markets. Collapse of the gold standard also ushered in a period of rapid growth in the world's major currencies and the consequent push towards double-digit inflation during the 1970s. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 was in retaliation of Washington's support of Israel in the Mideast War. Oil production at home could not make up the shortfall of imports from the Middle East. This crisis led to gas lines, and oil prices went higher. In 1978, the Iranian Revolution witnessed another cut in oil imports from the Middle East and another major oil shock. This would be the second oil crisis of the 1970s. By 1981, U.S. oil consumption had dropped nearly 15% from its 1978 peak. Higher oil prices pushed for oil production developments in Mexico, on the Alaska North Slope, and in the North Sea. As more supply came onto the market, this led to lower demand and hence lower prices. By the mid-1980s, oil was selling for $25 a barrel in today's dollars. OPEC's market share in the global arena fell from 55% to 30%. Between 1979 and 1983, demand from the West declined for Middle Eastern oil by more than 5 million barrels per day, or more than 10% of demand at the time. The final response was the collapse of oil prices in 1986. The American oil industry was devastated as world oil prices fell in the 1980s. Oil-producing states such as Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma fell into semi-depression. In the case of Texas, a domino effect shook industries throughout its economy. During the oil boom years of the 1970s, many people invested millions of dollars in the Houston market and other major cities throughout the state. When OPEC fell in the early 80s, Texas went spiraling down, bursting bubbles left and right in several of its markets. Investors pulled out of Texas, and the savings and loan, banking, and real estate industries began a period of steady decline, which was still very much in progress as the world entered the 1990s. There were 200 bank failures in America in 1987, and most of them occurred in the oil-depressed states. The 1990s began with a war that was strictly about oil. Iraq seized the oil fields of Kuwait, and thus began the First Gulf War. On August 2, 1990, President Saddam Hussein of Iraq ordered his army to invade neighboring Kuwait. The world was thrown into a state of shock, and America, as the world's only mega superpower, took the leadership role in stopping any further aggression by the Iraqi regime. Middle Eastern oil was at stake. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer for the Western world and a major economic ally of America, was threatened. America, along with the aid of the United Nations, organized an international blockade and sanctions in a massive effort to isolate Saddam Hussein and his 1 million-man army. The Iraqi affair escalated into what appeared to be a massive buildup toward a long-term presence of American troops in the Middle East. With the price of oil changing with every word spoken by Saddam Hussein or President Bush, the entire world was biting its fingernails, hoping for a peaceful settlement. With war cries being heard from all corners of the Middle East, the chance for peace did not look good. Eventually, America and the world fell into a worldwide recession by the escalation of this crisis. The political and economic realities of global oil business empires drove the world into a war during the first quarter of 1991. This brief war was decisively won by the American-led Allied coalition, which established a new political dominance in the region. The American victory was based on a number of factors, but most significant was the massive $1 trillion in high-technology investments in the defense industry during the 1980s that guaranteed superior air power and the unprecedented economic, political, and military coalition put together by Bush and company to stop the Saddam war machine. The cost of this high-tech war would total over $100 billion, with the Allies pledging to pay $53.5 billion of the total costs. Thus, the Allies financed over half of the war's expenses, Japan's pledge alone totaling $13 billion. America literally had to pass the hat to finance this war. The success of Desert Storm strengthened the economic and political relationship between America and Saudi Arabia. It reached the point to where the Saudis had gradually assumed a position similar to the Japanese as one of America's most important economic allies. The match between the world's largest oil consumer and the world's largest oil producer was a logical one. By 1992, Saudi Arabia would be supplying America with 24% of its oil imports, purchasing billions of dollars in military hardware and investing billions more in the American economic system. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, A new world was being created in the 1990s, a world that dramatically increased the consumption of global oil. In addition, China and India were moving forward with greater development programs, building infrastructure, and expanding into the information age revolution. There would be a growing and steady demand for oil and other natural resources, a trend that had to continue given the fact that the entire world was attempting dynamic economic growth programs at the same time. The strain on finite resources was inevitable, and with the start of the 21st century, the economic strain, intense competition, and imbalances were starting to unfold. Oil shock has accompanied, or at least been one factor linked to, the onset of every U.S. recession over the past 35 years. When oil is above $85 a barrel, we are likely to see a recession coming, which is what occurred during the oil shock recession of 2007 through 2008. Oil was one of the triggers that ignited the meltdown. In July 2008, the price of a barrel of oil soared to $147. The straw that finally broke the camel's back. Oil and stock prices had been moving in tandem in the pre-crash period of 2007. In the devastating crash of 2008, both prices fell during the meltdown. In 2012, we were in oil shock territory, where the economy was choking on high oil prices. The price at the pump had remained structurally high. An oil shock recession was brewing. Oil prices remaining above $90 a barrel was a serious threat. What did that mean? It meant that even a small but strategic event could trigger escalating prices in the short run and create panic and long gas lines in a very short period of time. One such fuse that could ignite the next oil shock is Iran. The U.S. and the world accused Iran of having a nuclear weapons development program, which it has denied. In early 2012, the price surge in oil prices started reflecting all of the buying by investors and speculators anticipating conflict in the Middle East. If an actual event occurs, prices will move higher, and in some cases, a lot higher. Analysts began speculating in the media that Israel may attack Iran in late summer or early fall. As Iran reduced its exports to the West, particularly to EU nations, prices moved higher and stayed there. Inflation, the threat of an oil shock recession, Middle East tensions, and Iran, the potential threat of a euro collapse, and turmoil in Europe were key concerns of global markets as we headed into the summer of 2012. Peak oil. Peak oil is a point in time when the maximum rate of global petroleum extraction is reached, after which the rate of production enters terminal decline. M. King Hubbert predicted that the production in U.S. oil fields would hit peak oil in the early 1970s. Oil production rose steadily in the 1950s and 60s. However, in 1970, production began to decline. In December 1970, oil peaked in the U.S. at 10.2 million barrels per day. According to Hubbert, an oil field will peak once half of the oil in that field has been extracted. From that point forward, the field would be in a period of steady decline. This production cycle is represented in a bell-shaped curve that illustrates the rise, the peak, and the declining period. Hubbert concluded that when all of the low-hanging fruit had been picked, easy conventional oil fields, the peak would have been reached and a period of decline would commence. This analysis is the same for oil fields throughout the world. What happened in America, which had been the leading oil producer in the world until the 1970s, would happen in the rest of the world. Hubbert's process has been used thousands of times for thousands of different fossil fuel reserves. It is a highly respected procedure in the fossil fuel energy industry, and for the most part, it is considered a reliable analysis. The North Sea oil fields boomed for 30 years, producing 15 billion barrels of oil, and then peaked in 1999 for the Britain side of the production oil fields. Since then, output has been on a steady decline. Alaska's North Slope was a major find in America. However, it peaked in the mid-1980s and is now in decline. The source of the easy, cheap oil is on decline. Production of the North Slope of Alaska and the North Sea of Europe were strong production regions 20 years ago, but have followed the trajectory of Hubbard's analysis. Europe peaked in 2000. The motherlode of crude oil remains in the Middle East. Complicating the issue of peak oil is the acquisition of accurate information on global oil fields. There is ample evidence that several key oil producers have been providing misleading information concerning the remaining reserves in their oil fields. For instance, OPEC's reserves are overstated. Analysts have observed inconsistencies in the reports presented by several nations. A report presented by geologist Dr. Colin Campbell and his colleague Jean Laherrer in 1998 gave reasons for major concerns. For example, between 1980 and 1989, Saudi Arabia, the country with the largest reserves, reported only nominal changes. Then, in 1990, the country reported that its reserves had grown by nearly 90 billion barrels. A similar mystery enfolds the oil picture in Iraq and Iran. After a period in which its reported reserves had remained more or less constant, Iraq, in 1988, announced that they had more than doubled to 100 billion barrels. And Iran has followed an identical pattern, nearly doubling its estimate of reserves in 1988 after years of stagnation. The reality is that OPEC has less oil than it claims, and we are living in the time of global peak oil when supply is limited and demand is rising. So it is reasonable to say that if the numbers are not accurate, no one really knows how much oil is left, particularly in the Middle East. Similar conclusions have been reached by other analysts trying to determine the amount of oil left in the world. Author and investor Charles Goyette informs us that when OPEC began basing production quotas on reserves, most of the member nations began making substantial increases in their reported reserves. In a display of candor, an Iranian oil official has claimed that Iran's official reserves are vastly overstated. In 2006, Petroleum Intelligence Weekly reported that Kuwait had only half its officially stated reserves. Several years ago, Mexico found itself having to cut its official stated reserves in half. With an energy resource so critical to the continuance of modern civilization, it's amazing how the entire world is dancing along under a series of false assumptions and illusions about the true physical quality of oil reserves. It's extremely interesting that the entire world is dependent on oil production in the Middle East, which is questionable. Even if we did have accurate data on their oil wells, which I don't believe we do, most of these nations have either hit peak oil or are very close to that point. Stephen and Donna Lieb make a valid point as they write, OPEC producers themselves are reaching limits that will exacerbate the world's oil woes. Increasing oil supplies sufficiently to meet the world's needs for continued growth will soon be beyond anyone's abilities. The Middle East is really the last bastion of oil in the world, with nearly two-thirds of the world's proven conventional reserves, and the Saudis have not found a big new field in decades. Experts have taken note of technical reports indicating water is coming up in the oil wells in some Saudi Arabian production sites. At the point when water begins to appear in a well, the productive life is over. There's a huge concern that the Middle East may not be able to produce the needed supply in future periods. The scary part about all of this is that nobody really knows. The fact of the matter is no one really knows if Saudi Arabia has peaked. Some analysts believe that Saudi Arabia hit peak oil in 2005 and that production has fallen 1.1 million barrels a day. Others believe that as of 2012, Saudi Arabia has not peaked. According to some analysts, Iran, the world's fourth largest producer, peaked in 1978, and its production has been falling for 38 years. Russia's oil production has been falling since 1987. Charles Goyette offers this insight. China, a net oil exporter through the 1970s and 1980s, has been a net importer for more than 15 years. Indonesia, an OPEC member since 1961, gave up its membership in 2008 because it is no longer a net exporter. Thanks to its North Sea production, Great Britain became a net exporter in 1980. In the last few years, it has again become an importing country. Mexico is consuming a greater share of its declining production. This issue of peak oil is still strongly debated between those who believe that we will have another 1 to 2 decades of abundant oil versus those who believe in imminent shortage. The optimists point to a United States Geological Survey (USGS) study concluded in 2000, which states that there is at least 50% more oil left than what the pessimists predict. The report indicated that vast new reserves still remain to be found. However, in 2012, many European countries were paying the equivalent of $8 to $9 per gallon for gasoline, and in the United States the price per gallon hovered around $4 for nearly 2 years. Throughout 2011, oil traded above the 100 mark, except for a few days. In addition, why are producers now pursuing all of the unconventional sources of oil, which requires a lot more financial resources to produce? Oil producers have accelerated unconventional oil production: shale, tight and heavy oil, bitumen, and oil sands. There's a great deal of this unconventional source of oil in the U.S. and Canada. It costs more to produce this oil, and this will continue to add upward pressure on prices. The tar sand oil in Alberta, Canada, has deposits estimated at 1.6 trillion barrels of oil, an amount that exceeds the world's remaining reserves of ordinary crude. This oil is a residue created when conventional oil escaped from its birthplace deep in the Earth's crust and was degraded into tar by groundwater and bacteria. Every step of the way to get this oil takes brute force. It's essentially a mining operation. For each barrel of oil acquired, 2 tons of tar sand is strip mined. Gigantic dump trucks the size of small office buildings haul 400 tons of this stuff in single loads to the next phase of the operation, where the sand is washed in giant washing machines. Torrents of warm water and solvent rinse out the tar or bitumen, leaving wet sand that is dumped in tailing ponds. The bitumen then has to be cooked in cokers where temperatures of 900 degrees Fahrenheit breaks up the giant tar molecules to turn it back into crude oil. It takes 3 barrels of water to extract 1 barrel of bitumen. The Athabasca River is the main source of water used in these operations. The water has to be heated, and that requires vast amounts of natural gas. This production process is expensive and is clearly driving up the cost of gasoline at the pump. Estimates are that the tar sands will provide up to 2 million barrels a day by 2014. When we examine deep water oil drilling, a similar reality emerges in high costs and difficulty in producing the oil. When things go wrong, it gets real messy, especially when uncontrollable oil spills occur. Various types of oil spills have been happening in our world for nearly 70 years, and they've all been detrimental to the environment, ecosystems, and marine life. The BP oil spill that happened on April 20, 2010, gave the world a startling example of waste and destruction. This was considered the worst ecological disaster in U.S. history. In the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon rig suffered a massive explosion. It was a fiery inferno, with flames soaring 200 feet in the air. The fire was fueled by a busted wellhead originating deep in the ocean floor. Of the 126 people on board, 11 died, 17 people were injured, and 115 were saved. The world watched in horror as 60,000 barrels of oil per day, or 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, flowed out of the hole in the ocean floor. For days they searched for a solution, and there was none. Up to 16,000 miles of coastline was affected, including the coasts of Texas, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The gushing well wasn't capped until July 2010. President Obama announced, and BP executives agreed, to set aside a $20 billion oil spill response fund for the massive cleanup and spill victims. This was the biggest oil spill in American history. 4.9 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. An additional 1.8 million gallons of chemical dispersant was poured into the affected area to deal with the crisis. Needless to say, the chemical dispersant and crude oil had an absolutely devastating impact on the marine life in the area. More than 600 sea turtles were found dead, 4,300 oiled birds were found, and more than half of them were dead. Many other endangered species were impacted: whales, manatees, and other marine life living in the area. A similar event occurred in Brazil on November 7, 2011. A major Chevron oil spill took place off the coast of Rio de Janeiro. Deep water drilling caused the spill of over 110,000 barrels of crude oil. Brazil fined Chevron $28 million. If there's such an abundance of oil on our planet, why are producers drilling 1 or 2 miles down in the ocean for oil and conducting mining operations to strip oil out of tar sands? These are the unconventional last frontiers and are indications that the world has reached peak oil in conventional sources of oil. The rates of decline in conventional oil fields that have passed their production peak are accelerating. What appears to be happening globally is the reality of a world that is quickly running out of cheap, abundant oil in the face of extraordinary demand from developing and developed nations. In other words, global peak oil has arrived at a point in history when the entire world is trying to build modern high-tech societies. Global discoveries peaked in the 1960s and have been declining ever since. Many geologists, oil analysts, economists, and others have given dates for when the world has or will hit peak oil. It's clearly not a question of if, but when this fateful event will occur. For many years I was concerned about oil, but not about an imminent collapse. I had bought into the argument of 2030 as being the end of oil. I speculated about the demise of oil without any deep study. Now I study the demise. For me, the realization is that when the world's supply peaks, it will be difficult to meet demand. Unconventional sources, such as the Canadian tar sands, are costly, and extraction is ripping apart the environment. It's called synthetic oil. The production is expensive, and over time will become more expensive. Much of the same argument can be made regarding the environment and expensive costs when we consider deep water drilling. In addition, the new reality of geopolitical oil markets is continued friction and conflict. We now have a permanent constriction in oil that will keep prices high. Thus, oil prices will rise and stay high due to the rising cost of production and insufficient supply. Some analysts have predicted that global production of oil peaked in 2002. For others, the year was 2005 or 2006. Many geologists came to the same conclusion that global peak oil had essentially arrived sometime before the year 2010. The evidence appears to be overwhelming that we hit peak oil in 2006 and that the period between 2010 and 2015 will be the most vulnerable as the world moves towards a supply ceiling in 2015. Thus, in 2012, we were in the red zone. Many analysts and geologists gave 2010 as the year when the oil squeeze would set in and peak oil would bring declines and higher oil prices, which is what the world was experiencing in the first half of 2012. As we move into the future, supply constraints will result from irreducible and irreversible geological realities. According to David Green of Oak Ridge National Laboratory, world production will most likely peak about 2016, and outside the Middle East around 2006. Demand is rising while supply is falling. There is no precedent in human history for what will happen when a global civilization runs out of oil or is confronted with a major oil shortage. Increasing demand for oil and continued instability in the Middle East, as well as speculators in the futures markets, will keep the price of oil high and, by extension, gas high. Gas prices could suddenly skyrocket out of control. I am now completely convinced that the West is burying its head in the sand on this issue of peak oil. The U.S. uses 25% of the available oil in the world, yet this nation is not working on a comprehensive transition plan to deal with a time when there will be no more cheap, abundant conventional oil. Even if we were certain that the world would run out of oil by 2050, I would still say that we should be actively pursuing a comprehensive transition plan, pumping trillions of dollars into research and development and infrastructure projects. A sudden collapse in the supply of oil will affect everything. Oil is ubiquitous and permeates all aspects of modern civilization. We are beyond addiction to oil. We have made it an absolute necessity and allowed it to have almost divine presence. Experts tell us that it will take decades to comfortably make the technological shift away from oil. A sudden and dramatic break from oil means a lot of unpleasant developments. War, starvation, economic collapse, a huge number of dislocations, and quite a few unknowns, X factors, that would quite literally blow up in our faces. We do not want to gamble and wait to the last minute to do this. The end of cheap oil will force the development of new economic models. Globalization will be scaled back in favor of localization. As transportation costs skyrocket, corporations, governments, etc. will begin to produce more in their home markets. Local food production, energy conservation, lower energy usage, and looking at what's sustainable will be the new paradigm. Whole new economic models will be built and conceived on the new use of energy. We'll have to learn to live without oil and focus on what's sustainable and what's renewable. The transition period. Politicians will react to an oil crisis, but few will initiate forward-thinking solutions and actively start the process of living in a world without oil. The rule of politics is not to raise a problem if you don't have a solution, so we can't really expect a grand solution from politicians until we have a massive crisis on our hands. The dire reality is that the world needs a plan for the end of oil. What can we do today to prepare for tomorrow? Entrenched vested interests are delaying the process. Status quo delay tactics. Economists and others tell us that a comprehensive transition program should have been started in the 1970s during the first two major oil shocks. However, for decades, industry and politicians have been reluctant to tackle the problem largely because of the entrenched wealth and politics of oil. In effect, we are waiting until the last minute. But in 2012, the day of reckoning has arrived. We live in an exponential world where things are accelerating at a faster pace. Faced with a world in hyperdrive, it's imperative that this civilization understands its predicament. At this point, it really doesn't matter how much oil is left in the ground. We need to start the transition period immediately. Predicaments have outcomes, not solutions. This is why it is extremely important not to wait for some unknown day of reckoning to hit us in the face one unsuspecting morning when we wake up and find that the world is confronted with a massive oil crisis. We need to have a full-blown, comprehensive energy transition plan in complete operation. Our world is on a collision course with finite oil. The fields are going to top out, then trickle and run dry. No one knows for sure when this day of reckoning is going to hit. As stated earlier, predictions and estimates are all over the board. 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, and right now. Geologists and economists are in deep discussions on when global oil has or will peak. It's an event that is coming, and no one doubts that point. But the question of when is a huge unknown, and that's not a comforting thought. What peak oil means in real terms is that it marks the change from an increasing supply of cheap oil to a dwindling supply of expensive oil. When we enter this period, we can expect shortages, sudden price hikes, economic disruptions, and desperate actions by nations to secure the last sources of oil on the planet. The junkie syndrome will be in full operation as oil-starved nations struggle for survival. The world is confronted with a major paradigm shift. We need a comprehensive energy policy, something designed to give us real energy reform. But special interests may be blocking the advent of viable solutions to our energy crisis. To comfortably make the transition and build out the infrastructure will take 30 years. Analysts say that a 20-year transition period would avoid any major consequences. A transition period of 10 years will mean some economic consequences. For instance, it will take at least 10 years to switch out our automobiles. If we wait until the last moment for this crisis to unfold, the world will be faced with an utter disaster. According to Alfred Cavallo, an energy consultant in Princeton, New Jersey, there are many things you can do to ease the transition, and you can have a very nice life on a sustainable system. Of course, not everyone is going to be driving SUVs. One of the first things that should have happened in 2012 was a global agreement among governments and automobile manufacturers to stop the production of combustion engine automobiles. These vehicles are not practical in a world faced with a dwindling supply of expensive oil. In fact, people should stop buying combustion engine automobiles, and then they will stop making them. The combustion engine vehicle is rapidly becoming a dinosaur and will eventually follow a path to extinction. Again, the mindset of this current era of leaders is steeped in the addiction of oil. In 2012, why were they still building combustion engine automobiles? President Obama stated in his 2012 State of the Union address that his administration would be pressing forward with clean energy initiatives for America. The differences in this chamber may be too deep right now to pass a comprehensive plan to fight climate change, but there's no reason why Congress shouldn't at least set a clean energy standard that creates a market for innovation. So far, you haven't acted. Well, tonight, I will. Obama has executive authority to get things done without congressional action. He should maximize his use of that authority to implement clean energy programs. If he truly believes in fighting climate change and in building a dynamic, renewable energy future for this nation, then he needs to act now and throw everything he can at the problem while he still has the power to do so. The Navy and the Interior Department were authorized to begin the purchase and development of huge renewable energy projects. He called on lawmakers to pass legislation that would create a standard for producing electricity from clean energy sources. Obama called for solar and wind projects to be developed on public lands. These projects would lay the foundation for providing renewable energy power for 3 million homes. Gridlock in Washington prevents the U.S. from establishing a comprehensive energy and environment policy. Early 2012 witnessed a strong uptick in oil speculation that played a role in keeping oil prices high. Speculation contributes about 15% of the price of oil. Political uncertainty is factored into this process, the so-called political premium, the cost the markets price into a barrel of oil based on uncertainty. In addition to these factors, oil prices stayed high in 2012 due to global demand, the outlook of the global economy, and perceived geopolitical threats to supply, such as the possibility of an attack on Iran. According to Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, what we need to do is limit the amount of oil any one company can control on the oil futures market. The function of these speculators is not to use oil, but to make profits from speculation, drive prices up, and sell. A gallon of gasoline increased 30 cents in 1 month. Speculators control 80% of the energy futures market. In 2011, excessive speculation added about $30 to the price of a barrel of oil. This, in turn, drained the U.S. economy of approximately $200 billion in consumer spending in 2011. This is yet another reason why the world must come to grips with the phenomenon of peak oil. Investors have and will continue to make hay out of this crisis as long as there is opportunity to do so. The Oil Junkie Syndrome. It is sheer madness not to pursue a transition program now, in 2013, in a world where India and China have awakened. The oil equation on the demand side has been permanently altered. In addition, the African continent is starting to pull out of its long period of economic underdevelopment with strong conditions for growth and development. Then there's the rest of the world, and we are all trying to feed daily on this finite oil substance like a junkie craving on a daily fix to stay high for a day. But in 24 hours, the same craving has to be satisfied again, and so it goes, day in and day out. In 2012, we were looking at a global habit of nearly 90 million barrels per day, and no one really knows how much of this stuff we have left. This civilization is insane to wait until the last day. Like the banks and the mortgage crisis of 2008, nothing gets done until it's too late. It will be crisis management. America is the most addicted to the oil drug. We have built an economy that is 100% dependent upon it. It is pervasive, and we can't escape the final verdict of the demise of oil. Since the 1970s oil shock, successive Democratic and Republican administrations have kicked the oil can down the road and are not willing to deal with the hard political realities. However, in 2013, we can't kick it anymore. We're operating in the red zone, but this problem is not given top priority status. In 2013 and beyond, we need a new deal on energy. There is this endless cycle of oil and the Middle East, a constant agonizing dependency and quagmire. The entire world is depending on Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries as the ultimate source, the ultimate dealer and supplier of oil. What if they are wrong about the amount of oil they have left in the ground? Moreover, the U.S. has to maintain a permanent military presence in the region in order to protect its interest in oil. This is economic insanity. No action has been taken to stop the oil addiction, even as worldwide demand is increasing exponentially. We're speeding towards a brick wall, and no one wants to put on the brakes. Or, put it another way, we are oil junkies, and there is no tomorrow. Just give us our fix today. The perfect metaphor for oil is the junkie that constantly needs a fix. After he shoots up, he's fine for a day, but the next day, the monkey is riding his back again. There's no end to the craving. He either quits the habit or continues to live the hellish existence of constantly needing a fix every day of his life in order to stay high. The moment there is no fix, he goes through the discomfort of withdrawal, which is a harrowing experience. The entire world is now hooked on oil, a finite resource. Like the junkie searching for his next fix for the day, countries all over the world are struggling to secure their share of this black gold, the next daily fix. This is not a sustainable situation, and I would argue that the current world civilization is playing a game no one can win. Like the junkie that has to go through withdrawal, countries all over the world that are deeply addicted will experience painful withdrawal symptoms. As oil junkies, we are driven by the insanity of oil. The addiction and ever-growing demand remains persistent, a daily necessity. Oil is ubiquitous. It permeates almost every aspect of our daily existence, from transportation to an entire galaxy of products and services we use: toothpaste, tires, ink, pipes, shingles, concrete, candles, adhesives, golf balls, formica, packing tape, lipstick, rope, shampoo, electrical insulation, crayons, synthetic fabrics, tape recorders, curtains, vitamin capsules, dashboards, putty, percolators, skis, insecticides, fishing lures, perfumes, shoe polish, petroleum jelly, faucet washers, food preservatives, antihistamines, cortisone, dyes, house paint, roller skates wheels, guitar strings, ammonia, eyeglasses, ice chests, life jackets, TV cabinets, car battery cases, insect repellent, refrigerants, typewriter ribbons, cold cream, glycerin, plywood adhesive, cameras, aesthetics, and many more. There are over 6,000 products made from oil. Food and oil are deeply intertwined. Oil is used in the food production process as muscle power, in the form of modern-day equipment and machinery, replacing man and animal power. It is also used in the development of fertilizers, insecticides, and pesticides. There seems to be no escape from oil. We are trapped in this endless craze of supply and demand. When will it end? How will it end, and how are we prepared for the finale, the end of the age of oil? There are over 800 million automobiles and counting in the world that need to be fueled daily, and ultimately, people will respond to prices. The complex global supply and demand system will shut down in the face of rapidly rising fuel costs. That's when the world's leaders will react, and not before a crisis. A sudden collapse in oil would bring about political, financial, and commercial collapse in regions all over the world. With the entire world hooked on oil, it means chaos and disaster. Alternative solutions. A consensus had developed in 2012 suggesting that the U.S., in making some preparations for the coming crisis, was moving in the direction of developing multiple sources of energy, both renewable and non-renewable. In Chapter 8, entitled Impact of the Information Age Revolution, I mention several renewable technologies that deserve massive research and development funding, as well as subsequent infrastructure development, solar and wind energy, fuel cell technology, and the hydrogen economy. Superconductivity and nuclear fusion are just some of the areas that are ripe with enormous potential. Now is the time to begin the massive infrastructure developments, not some point in the future. A comprehensive transition period should be designed to prevent a gigantic breakdown in the U.S. and global economy due to a collapse in oil. The U.S. reportedly has over 700 million barrels of oil in its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR. This amount should probably be raised to 1 to 2 billion barrels of crude oil as a safeguard to manage a period of extreme crisis. I also consider that a system of decentralizing electrical power grids is a better long-term solution given the frequency of natural disasters, the potential for energy disasters, and other unknown factors. New technologies should make it possible for many individual households to get off centralized power grids. These massive grids are old and dilapidated and need to be replaced by more streamlined, decentralized systems. The leading nation in the world for the use of ethanol fuel is Brazil. This nation currently has 14.3 million alternative vehicles on the road that will not be affected by the end of the oil age. Brazil is the first nation on the planet to have the best sustainable biofuel economy, and its sugarcane ethanol is now considered the most successful alternative fuel in the global marketplace. A major key to their success is planning. Brazil began its program of energy independence nearly 4 decades ago. Natural gas. Several leading experts and energy organizations have stated that the U.S. has vast natural gas resources. According to the Energy Information Administration, EIA, the estimated recoverable natural gas resources in the United States is roughly 1,279.5 trillion cubic feet, TCF. Natural gas is a fossil fuel comprised mostly of methane and is one of the cleanest burning alternative fuels on the market. It is also a non-renewable source of energy that could clearly support this nation through a comprehensive economic transition period. There are serious challenges in extracting this energy resource environmentally. However, natural gas is now being billed as the new fuel revolution in America. This resource is in such quantities that America is exporting natural gas to countries all over the world. Upwards of $37 billion was spent by foreign companies and nations for natural gas during the third quarter of 2011. According to T. Boone Pickens, an American business magnate, financier, and energy expert, natural gas is the critical puzzle piece that will help us to keep more of the $350 to $450 billion we spend on imported oil every year. Pickens has stated that the nation's big rig trucks can run on natural gas using a form of compressed natural gas, CNG, or liquefied natural gas, LNG, for less than $2 per gallon while reducing emissions. Many companies are switching over to LNG to power their diesel engine trucks, forklifts, generators, tractors, and more. Some companies are even switching their diesel-fueled oil rigs to LNG energy. Thus, natural gas is used in homes, for commercial business use and can be used to fuel cars and trucks. According to analysts, by the end of 2011, there were 14.8 million automobiles in the world capable of running on CNG or LNG. Various countries, such as Iran, Pakistan, Argentina, India, and Brazil, have moved into this technological arena. In addition, existing gasoline-driven vehicles can be converted to allow the use of LNG as well as retaining the capability of using gasoline. This is a viable option that requires the development of an LNG passenger vehicle infrastructure to accommodate millions of vehicles that will be converted for use with this new energy source. Pickens is also pushing solar energy and wind farms as additional ways for the U.S. to solve its energy problems and save money. In April 2012, the Obama administration began a process of building a working relationship with the producers of natural gas. Washington became more responsive to the full potential of natural gas as one of the ways to break America's dependency on foreign oil. With the energy and economic realities starting to sink in, the Obama administration set up an interagency task force to coordinate the development of natural gas in the U.S. As part of this new initiative, such contentious issues as water pollution and fracking, hydraulic fracturing, in Wyoming and Pennsylvania, and the use of diesel in fracking and drilling regulations were eased or relaxed by regulators. This drilling technique involves high-pressure injection of water and chemicals into the ground to split rocks apart in order to release natural gas and/or oil. With the boom in production a reality, opening America's last fossil fuel energy reserves appeared to have strengthened Obama's energy credentials for the 2012 election. The belief is that natural gas will be one of the new energy vectors prior to replacing oil. Optimists also presented evidence that employment in this sector is expected to grow by 600,000 jobs by the end of the decade. Heather Zickel, the top White House aide on energy, said in an interview, "We recognize that there is this important potential here, and we want to make sure we get it right. Our thinking has truly evolved both on the production and utilization side." In the U.S., the option will most likely be to convert the majority of passenger vehicles to run on natural gas. This will require a national commitment to implement a natural gas infrastructure development throughout America. In May 2012, the governor of Vermont, Governor Peter Shumlin, signed into law America's first ban on fracking in drilling for natural gas. Opponents of this procedure cite the risk of contamination of drinking water supplies and other environmental hazards. Groundwater contamination by chemicals seeping into the groundwater is a major fear concerning this process. In his public announcement, Governor Shumlin stated, "I hope other states will follow us. The science on fracking is uncertain at best. Let the other states be the guinea pigs. Let the Green Mountain State preserve its clean water, its lakes, its rivers, and its quality of life." Nuclear power. There are 104 nuclear fission reactors in the United States. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, voted 4-1 in December 2011 to approve the building of 2 new nuclear reactors in the U.S., after over 30 years of a de facto ban on building nuclear energy reactors. The U.S. finally threw in the towel to restart the building of new systems. This was approved after this country and the world has had a full opportunity to view the enormous catastrophe of the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. Allison Fisher, an energy expert for the consumer advocacy group Public Citizen, stated that it is inexplicable that we have chosen this moment in history to expand the use of a failed and dangerous technology. Considering Germany's decision to abandon nuclear fission power, it appears that the U.S. may not be thinking clearly. Allison further commented that the U.S. is approving new reactors before the full suite of lessons from Japan has been learned and before new safety regulations that were recommended by a task force established after the meltdown crisis at Fukushima have been implemented. According to Michael Golay, a professor at the USA Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, The economic argument for gas-fueled power plants is a lot stronger than investing in risky nuclear reactors. New nuclear plants are more questionable because there are economic factors right now which favor gas-fueled power plants, and the fact that the economy is only growing slowly means that nationally, the need for new generation is lower than people were expecting in 2007. In regards to the building of new generation power plants, Golay offers this analysis. A 1,000 megawatt natural gas plant takes a few years to permit and build, and costs up to $1 billion for the most efficient combined cycle model. A similar-sized nuclear reactor, however, could take 5 to 10 years to develop and build and cost well in excess of $5 billion. It is also important to understand that uranium, a finite mineral resource, is a key ingredient in the development of the nuclear fission power, and like oil, is a rapidly depleting resource. Nuclear fission power is another relic, dinosaur, of the industrial era, and like the combustion engine, is on a path to extinction. Why is the U.S. committing 5 to 10 years and billions of dollars to a failed technology? Golay's analysis was examined by Mexico, and that nation chose to abandon a plan to build 10 new nuclear reactors. In recognizing its abundance of natural gas, Mexico decided to pursue a course of building natural gas power plants. However, as part of the pledge to expand nuclear power, the Obama administration offered the Vogtle nuclear project $8.3 billion in federal loan guarantees. The only conclusion I could arrive at was that this was the wrong decision, especially in the wake of the meltdown in Japan. When major disasters like these occur, we as human beings must learn the valuable lessons from the errors and failures in the technology. It makes no sense to simply ignore and/or sweep aside the event and assume that it will not happen on our shores because we will have better safeguards. As Alison Fisher stated, this is a failed and dangerous technology, and it needs to be abandoned. The decision to move forward with new nuclear plants is flawed, and resources would be better spent on renewable technologies and other options. In Chapter 11 of this publication, I stated, world governments simply cannot predict nor protect their populations from the unexpected chaos and destruction of natural disasters. No matter how well designed and newly constructed with the latest technologies nuclear power plants are built, there simply are no fail-safe systems that we can rely on given the unpredictable nature of natural disasters. This civilization has to factor in the explosive destructive power of natural disasters when considering the use and operation of such potentially harmful technology as nuclear fission. The risks of widespread radioactive fallout in a heavily populated region are just too great to keep such technology in operation. The first year-long struggle in Japan to contain the crisis was an eye-opener and should have been an important wake-up call to the entire world civilization to abandon nuclear fission technology. Nuclear power plants are also vulnerable to terrorist attacks, and there's also the issue of nuclear waste that has to be buried safely in the ground. Nuclear fission is old industrial-era technology that should be retired along with the use of oil. When it comes to nuclear power, the focus should be nuclear fusion research. After 5 decades of research, scientists should be getting closer to a practical solution in nuclear fusion technology. However, even if we are decades away from a working model, this should still remain the central thrust in this energy sector. Nuclear fusion would be a renewable and non-polluting technology. In mid-August 2013, nearly 2.5 years after the nuclear meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, see Chapter 11, the Japanese government reported that the Fukushima plant was leaking up to 300 tons of contaminated or radioactive water per day into the Pacific Ocean. Some experts stated that the problem could get worse with another explosion. This was further proof that nuclear fission power is a failed and dangerous technology that needs to be abandoned. Afghanistan and natural resources. In June 2010, a report surfaced that identified Afghanistan as having vast riches in mineral wealth. The value of the minerals were estimated at $1 trillion and as high as $3 trillion. The list of minerals critical to economic development in the modern world include huge veins of iron, copper, gold, cobalt, and lithium, which in recent years is supercritical in the production of laptops, BlackBerries, and other high-tech components. The report indicated that Afghanistan could become one of the most important mining centers in the world. General David H. Petraeus, commander of the United States Central Command at the time, stated, "There are a lot of ifs, of course, but I think potentially it's hugely significant." Jalil Jamriani, an advisor to the Afghan Minister of Mines, commented, "This will become the backbone of the Afghan economy." According to the extensive aerial surveys conducted by American geologists in 2006 and 2007, iron and copper deposits would make Afghanistan a major producer in the world. Other minerals such as niobium, a soft metal used in producing superconducting steel, and rare earth elements have been uncovered. The lithium deposits could turn Afghanistan into the Saudi Arabia of these types of deposits in the world. Currently, Bolivia has the world's largest known lithium reserves. With a GDP of only $12 billion annually, the Afghan economy would achieve a major boost in productivity once the mining operations are moving forward. Natural resource developments in Afghanistan represent a new frontier for hard-to-find minerals that are critical to modern civilization. Oil shock of 2012. The price of a barrel of oil moved from $75 in October 2011 to more than $100 by February 2012. Due to an oil refinery fire and other external factors in California, motorists in the Golden State witnessed gas prices soaring to $5 and higher per gallon for a brief period during the third quarter of 2012. It didn't take much to see rapid price hikes and long lines at the pump, especially in Southern California. Even though Americans are driving less, this is not having much of an impact on prices. With oil inventories at very low levels around the world, and with ever-increasing higher demand from emerging markets such as China and India, the pressure of higher prices will remain on this finite resource. And with the pressure on oil prices, gasoline prices will remain at or near $4 per gallon in America and $8 to $9 per gallon in various parts of Europe. Any sudden shock to the global economic system will have an immediate impact and send gasoline prices soaring. Some of the factors that could erupt and create calamity are as follows. 1. The embargo on Iran in 2012 created imbalances and had several nations scrambling to replace the oil that they are not receiving from Iran. For instance, Japan agreed to cut its crude oil imports from Iran by 20%. With all of its nuclear reactors shut down, Japan, by necessity, was forced to put pressure on current global oil production and, by extension, prices. 2. A sudden incident in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow strait and shipping choke point where the world's transportation of oil takes place daily. Some 3.2 million barrels per day are transported through this narrow point headed for the west. Major disruptions could result in $200 to $300 per barrel oil. 3. A geopolitical event in other oil-critical nations such as Nigeria, the 14th largest producer in the world, Bahrain, Libya, or elsewhere. 4. The European crisis could suddenly spin out of control and erupt into a full-fledged collapse. 5. In 2013 and beyond, the pressure will remain for global production of 90 million barrels or higher per day, and that is a tremendous amount of pressure. When oil supplies were taken off the market in the 1970s, twice, the price of oil quadrupled. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 wreaked major havoc on the U.S. economy. Long lines at the gas pump, the stock market was knocked flat on its back with average shares losing half of their value. The Iran-Iraq War of 1979 again quadrupled oil prices. Inflation soared with interest rates and mortgage rates following in tandem. During Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the price of oil doubled in 1 month and nearly tripled in 3 months. The price of oil had been rising to the $100 level in 2007 and then soared to $147 a barrel in July 2008. A combination of factors came together on this one: explosive demand by China and a series of wars and conflicts in Iraq, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria quadrupled the price of oil, sending it to the record high of $147 a barrel. A few months later, we had the meltdown of 2008. This was one of the main reasons that caused the meltdown. When the recession settled in, the contracting demand ushered in a rapid decline in the price per barrel, $147 to $34 per barrel. By December 2008, a gallon of gasoline had fallen to $1.66 from a high of $4.11 per gallon. This was another example that recessions are preceded by oil price spikes 90% of the time. In 2012, it was Iran. The report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, released in late 2011, included evidence that suggested that the Islamic Republic was clandestinely working on a nuclear bomb. Tehran claimed that it was developing atomic energy for peaceful purposes. That started the friction and the sanctions. Israeli saber-rattling and Iran's defiant posture helped to increase the move to higher oil prices. In addition, Iran warned that it would cut off oil to Britain and France in retaliation for sanctions put in place by the EU and the United States. That threat alone pushed up oil prices. Business as usual in a world that is screaming and belching of problems of unsustainable natural resource depletion and pollution will eventually drown the entire world in unspeakable misery. Michael Rupert, investigative journalist and author, calls it the cataclysmic end of a paradigm. Supply and demand issues. To get a sense of how the demand part of the equation is changing rapidly, it's important to examine the emergence of China and the oil connection. China's thirst and acquired addiction for oil has this country running all over the world, securing supplies and signing contracts in every corner of the earth. In Brazil, throughout the continent of Africa, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Canadian tar sands, and Kazakhstan. China is not expanding its political power. It has its empire. In its rush to build a modern high-tech society, this nation has acquired a voracious appetite for natural resources. China's consumption grew from 8.2 million barrels per day to 9.1 million in just 1 year, from 2011 to 2012. The competition is fierce, especially with the U.S. In fact, the definition of China means intense competition for everything, especially natural resources. The reality is that China and India have to have more and more energy to continue on their path of growth. This is a trajectory that is permanent in the foreseeable future as long as it can be sustained. The mathematics for much higher oil prices is baked into the expected future economic growth patterns of emerging nations such as China. In 1994, China's use of oil was minuscule, and its streets were filled with bicycles rather than cars. In 2003, 2 million cars were purchased, 70% above the 2002 level. Oil more than doubled in price from January 2007 to July 2008 due to the sharp increase in demand from China. Consumption levels are expected to hit 11 million barrels per day by 2015. Within 5 years, with 2012 as the base year, China may add another 125 million cars on the road. Thus, China is just getting started, and this momentum is irreversible. In 2012, the majority of the planet's nations were trying to create modern societies hooked on oil. Worldwide demand was exploding. To get a sense of the supply side of the equation, we need to examine the source of the dwindling supplies. OPEC, Mexico, and Russia are now consuming 13 million barrels of oil per day. The oil dealers and producers are starting to consume more of their own oil production, which means less oil for the export markets. With global demand exceeding 90 million barrels of oil daily in 2012, that means that new sources of oil will need to come online to replace the rapidly depleting global reserves. With OPEC members consuming more of their own oil at home, and with conventional sources of cheap oil rapidly diminishing, we are left with the conclusion that this is an unsustainable situation. We have essentially a fall-off of supply during a period of increasing demand. There is a 2 to 3% decline in supply each year. If the global market was to suddenly experience a 5% decrease in the oil supply, prices will double at the pump. If the price of oil goes to $200 per barrel, we may be looking at $7 per gallon gasoline in the U.S. and something a lot worse in Europe and parts of Asia. The first major shock is likely to be gas lines similar to the 1970s crisis. We may also experience a 1973-style oil embargo by some critical nation in the Middle East. The International Energy Agency, IEA, reported that the world's oil supply rose 1.3 million barrels a day in the last 3 months of 2011, while demand increased only 0.7 million barrels during the same period. Given this scenario, global markets should have experienced lower prices. However, that did not happen. Prices remained at or above $100 a barrel based on factors other than supply and demand. One of those factors was speculating bets by hedge funds and other money managers that oil prices would continue to rise. Summary. The end of the age of oil does not have to be a disaster if our current civilization and its leaders take the necessary steps for the massive preparation for a new age in clean energy. In America, the struggle will be intense, and it will most likely result in a very difficult transition. In the U.S. and elsewhere, there are companies working on alternative petroleum-based products to replace the use of oil in thousands of products we use daily. As part of a strategy to reduce the reliance on imported oil, America has expanded its options with the oil fields and natural gas reserves of North Dakota. Considered the second leading oil-producing state in the U.S., North Dakota produced 152.9 million barrels of oil in 2011. Natural gas production came in at 620.8 million cubic feet by March 2012. The state is planning $3 billion in infrastructure improvements to process natural gas and move it to the market. With 210 rigs, the North Dakota oil boom is making a small difference. Oil workers are making six-figure salaries in a tough economic environment. However, even with increased domestic production, Americans are not likely to see a substantial decrease in the price of gas at the pump. When we look at the ratio of energy returned on energy invested, EROEI, it helps us to understand why the oil we produce today is more expensive. During the early years of conventional oil production, it took 1 barrel of oil to find, extract, and produce 100 barrels of oil. The ratio was 100 to 1. In 2012, that ratio was trending between 12 to 1 and 18 to 1 for imported conventional oil, and for some of the unconventional stuff, such as oil from tar sands, we were looking at between 5.2 and 5.8 to 1. These numbers are only going to get worse in a world of exponential growth and a constant increase in demand. We're looking at a global civilization fighting a desperate battle to cling to its oil addiction. This is clearly not sustainable. OPEC and non-OPEC nations are still the oil barons of the world. The U.S. will continue to import 2/3 of its oil until it is no longer necessary to do so, or until the oil market finally collapses. Our foreign policy is focused on energy and will remain so for the foreseeable future. America is a nation on wheels. Our cities were built based on the use of cars. That use was dependent on $50 oil and $2.50 or less gasoline. All of that has changed, and America will have to rapidly adjust to a new global reality. As a nation with 220 million passenger vehicles, there's an urgent need to address the issue of peak oil. But this revolution will have to be initiated at the grassroots level and by forward-thinking green technology companies. The Obama administration has promoted a clean energy initiative. However, support from Republican lawmakers and entrenched business interests has not materialized on a grand scale. As a nation, America is deeply divided on what needs to be done about peak oil. This nation is completely addicted, and the attitude is, drill, baby, drill, until we can't drill no more. This chapter is based on the premise that we are in the red zone, and that time is short. We need to begin to finally tackle this issue before it becomes unmanageable. By instituting a comprehensive transition program to deal with the end of oil, our global civilization will have an opportunity to engineer a better solution to this inevitable crisis. The entire world has benefited and enjoyed the age of oil, but that party is over. The clean energy revolution has arrived.